What dark family secret were you let in on once you were old enough? Story 1. I found out I had a sister who had been given up for adoption. The only reason I found out was the person who informed me no longer felt bound to secrecy after my mom died. And the person who told me had receipts solid enough that I have no reason to doubt them. It also explains why Mom freaked out when I told her I'd done a 23andMe test. 23andMe is how my father discovered he had a bonus cousin. Turns out his uncle had a fling before leaving for World War II that resulted in a chill he either never told anyone about or didn't even know himself. When my father looked at her, the cousin, she happened to live in the same city. He and my aunts contacted her and all met up for lunch. Turns out the woman had been searching for years to find her father's side of the family. As far as I know, they still keep in touch. Story 2. I found out when I was about 32 that apparently in 1973, my dad had a daughter he never knew existed. I found out because he texted that to me while I was working, after finding out about it himself about 1 week earlier. She was in her late 40s by that point, I think. What's sort of tragic is that all this time, we thought I was my dad's only kid, and he always wanted a daughter, but never got one due to the marriage ending. He would have loved this girl. His daughter was the result of a one-night stand with a girl he never talked to again, and according to his daughter, the mother had a mental breakdown not long after giving birth and never really had custody of the daughter anyway. Dad never would have had any way to find out. The baby grew up with the mother's parents in another state, and the mother kinda went absent without leave. Story 3. My parents had 2 kids before I was born. My mother drowned them in a bathtub during a psychotic episode. Somehow, despite this and a prior history of mental illness, she got released and had me a couple years later. They had another child just before I turned 2, but I never laid eyes on her. Neither of them ever fessed up, though. I only found out about their existence after an aunt died and left me her personal effects. I found birth announcements for these other kids in her mementos. I always thought she meant for me to find them. When I asked my parents, they refused to discuss anything related to these kids. A few years later, I went back to my hometown and looked up that date in the newspaper morgue. The friend who went with me was floored. I wasn't really. I'd grown up in fear for my life from her rages. I broke off contact with them as soon as I could, not just because of this, though it didn't help. I had a slew of my own traumas growing up. It was a huge mistake to let them try to raise another child. Story 4. Your last line really resonated with me. My granddad died on my 7th birthday in nowhere near as horrendous circumstances as what happened to your uncle, mind you. The police showed up at our house around midnight looking for my dad, who was out working a night shift, and me being 7 excitedly ran down the stairs thinking the police had come to wish me a happy birthday. I remember my poor mom parking me in front of the telly with a bowl of Rice Krispies because I couldn't go back to sleep. I ended up not really liking or wanting birthdays for the rest of my childhood. And other than a little meal with my partner, I've never really celebrated them as an adult either. I think I always secretly worried that if I got excited about my birthday, something awful would happen. Story 5 of this really hit home. My dad tried, fortunately unsuccessfully, on my daughter's birthday. I don't think it was intentional that day, just an unfortunate coincidence. He was facing a lot of legal trouble, on top of decades-long untreated depression, as we found out later. That was over 10 years ago. He's in a much better place health-wise now, and my daughter and nieces still don't know what happened, since none of them were older than 8 at the time. Mental health of the U.S. military veterans is a huge problem in this country. His depression was linked back to his time in Vietnam that was covered up with alcohol abuse for a long time. Story 6. That sounds very similar to an event that happened to me, but it's not really a secret. Not anymore anyway. I'm 32 and I was 13 when I found out what happened. The day before my 9th birthday, I remember my mom getting a phone call and absolutely screaming the house down, bawling. I ran in because I thought something had happened to Dad. She didn't say anything, so I left really worried, but hoped it was something, I don't know, not that bad or something. The next day, I went to get my school uniform, as usual, but it was put away in the wardrobe. I asked why, and she said that we weren't going to school today because we had to travel to see family. We were like, oh, awesome. But then they sat us down. I was told at the time that my cousin, who was 15, died after falling out of a tree he was climbing. We were going to the funeral, etc. Obviously extremely upset and shocked, but we understood that it was an accident. Turns out that it wasn't. He actually hung himself, and his sister, my cousin, found him. My birthday is now the day that I think about him. Not in a I blame you for ruining my birthday way. Not at all. I don't care about the day I was born, lol. But for him, he was a cool kid. He would have been a great man. Story 7. My mother grew up in the American South. Her brother died in his early 20s, and she always told me it was a freak accident. A bullet came through the window, killing him. They lived in a rural area, so I never questioned it. One year, I inherited an old Korean War officer's sword after my grandpa passed. My mom freaked out and told me that it was too dangerous to keep and that we should sell it or get a safe to lock it up in. I thought it was weird, so I asked my dad, and he got this sad look on his face. Turns out my mom's brother was brutally murdered with a similar sword. In the 80s, he had gotten involved with some drug dealers, and they thought he had snitched about one of their big deals that got busted. No idea why they decided to use a sword, but it was pretty messed up to hear about. My mom had to ID the body. I found this out when I was 16, but she never directly acknowledged it until years later. My mom said he was just trying to make some extra cash by introducing people who partied to the dealers. I'm about his age now, and I can see how he just thought he was making a quick buck, never thinking something like that would get him killed. Story 8. My dad's side of the family has ties with the Mafia. Thankfully, my mom has long since divorced my dad, and they live a decent distance apart. I heard stories of my mom's parents who lived close by at the time circling the block in their truck late at night, soon after the divorce, to ensure no one was there to hurt us. I was very young at this point, probably like 3, 4, so I really have no memory of this. I do remember one night our garbage can was burned to the ground, and my mom has since told me about death threats soon after the divorce. My mom, a couple years ago, watched a documentary on prominent Mafia families and noted multiple names that were at her wedding. Story 9. When I turned 21, my grandfather told me a story about his older brother that I had never heard. My great uncle was a big boozer for most of his life. He passed at 92 and by then had switched from liquor to beer and wine. He also cut down to 1 pack of cigarettes a day instead of 2 after he had half a lung removed. Pap and my uncle grew up on a farm in the 30s and 40s. Mostly the family ran the farm by themselves, but from time to time they would hire drifters on as farmhands. In 1950, my uncle and one of the farmhands were out drinking, and they were driving back to the farm in my uncle's convertible. My uncle was the one driving, and he misjudged a turn that had a steep bank on the right side. He ran the car up the embankment, which was steep enough to flip it. My uncle was thrown from the car, but the farmhand he was drinking with was only halfway out of the car when it landed. Pap said he was severed clean into 2 pieces because the farmhand was just a drifter without any family to make much fuss, and because the Korean War had just started, my uncle was able to enlist and avoid any criminal charges. He was in Korea until the end of the war. That was the only time I've ever heard that story told, and although I would never be someone who has more than a few drinks before getting behind the wheel, it's something that definitely sticks in my mind, and it's a story I'll tell my own kids when they get their license. Story 10, I think this counts. My whole family found out at the same time about the dark secret. I was 25. My great-grandparents left their spouses for each other. Great-grandpa was 37, and great-grandma was 19 in Ireland. My GGPA had 7 children. My GGMA had 3. They left their spouses and children in the middle of the night to run away together and move to America, didn't say a word, and never talked to them again. When my grandpa, their only child from their new life, would ask them about their past or family, they got really weird and would refuse to say anything. They took the secret to their graves. My grandpa, at age 70, wanted an explanation about his heritage, so he signed up for Ancestry and 23andMe. Could you imagine how shocked he was to find out he had 10 siblings? They had been searching their whole lives to find out what happened to their parents. He got to meet them and would travel to visit them twice a year. My grandpa died 4 years ago. At least he got to know his siblings for a bit before he died. Happy, sad, and screwed up all at the same time. Story 11. We'll also submit a light one here. The story of my grandma's real name. Let's say that my whole life I knew my grandmother's name to be Mary. Everyone called her this. Everyone knew it. One day when I was in my 20s, I was with my grandmother and saw her sign some legal documents. She signed it as Edith. I was horribly confused. I asked Grandma about it, and she said her name was Edith, but it was never spoken, and to not use it. She is in her 80s at this point. Apparently, my great-grandfather had been an Air Force pilot stationed in the UK during World War I. He had a girlfriend at the time named Edith. After the war was over, they broke up. Great-grandpa returned home and married great-grandma shortly after. They had only one child, a girl, whom he named Edith. Roughly 18 months later, my great-grandmother saw a letter in the mail from an Edith and figured it out. She vowed the child would never be called the damn name ever again. She went by her middle name, Mary, though it was never legally changed. My own mother states she did not know her own grandmother's name until she was 22. I have had fun randomly dropping this name bomb on cousins here and there and enjoying the shock and laughter about it. It's a silly secret that nowadays just makes people giggle. Story 12. My paternal great-grandmother owned a wealthy cattle ranch around the turn of the last century on the Mexico-Texas border in the 1890s or 1900 S-ish. She didn't leave the ranch until she was 16 when she got pregnant and ran away because the baby belonged to the owner of the ranch and she thought he'd kill her if he found out. It was strange to learn that the old lady that would hold me and sing to me as a kid spent the first decade and a half of her life as property. I wasn't told any of this until after my grandmother, her daughter, passed away. My great-grandmother was very ashamed of her past, and I think by extension, so was my grandmother. Looking at old photos of my grandmother and her older brother, the baby she had at 16, he does look strikingly more European than my grandmother, an indigenous Mexican. My maternal grandfather was an abuser and harmed my mother and her siblings. It was a well-known secret in the family, which is even more disgusting. Growing up, I used to spend the night at my dad's parents' house all the time, but I don't have a single memory of spending the night at my mom's parents' house. Never once sat on his lap. Never once did my mom ever allow him to hug us. I never understood why my mom was so cold to him when my father was so close with his own father. I grew up resenting my mom for withholding us from a whole other set of grandparents and wished she would have told us sooner than when she finally did. I would have had more sympathy for her. Story 13. Not super dark or super secret, but when I had to do a project on my family tree in elementary school, one of the questions was, when did your family immigrate to America and why? For one of my great-grandfathers, my grandma told me life was very hard back in his country and it was getting dangerous to stay there. And for a long time I thought, yeah, I can see that. It was probably hard for a teenager living in Poland with World War I right around the corner, and I'm sure it was. But it turns out it's even harder and more dangerous when you're a teenager who has slept with a married woman and then accidentally killed her husband when he confronted you. I can see why she didn't want me to put that on my elementary school project. Story 14. Funny, I uncovered something about my family because of a project I did in college. Nothing dark. My grandfather is from China. He entered the U.S. lawfully on a temporary pass, left, and then re entered the U.S. unlawfully sometime later. However, in the time between entering the U.S. unlawfully and being apprehended by the authorities, the government learned that my grandfather had been inducted into the U.S. Army. He was not deported and served 2 years in the U.S. Army, ultimately resulting in an honorable discharge. What's cool about this, though, is he was having difficulty being granted naturalization. So difficult, in fact, that his case ended up being decided in his favor by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1959. It's kind of wild to think that if the Supreme Court ruled differently, I wouldn't even exist today. Story 15. Finally, I got one. From when I was aged 6 to 13, my mom dated a fellow named Murray. We all lived together in an old farmhouse. Murray was a wonderful father figure to us, but he also had a drinking and driving problem, and after a particularly nasty accident, Mom waited until he came home from the hospital and was well enough to take care of himself before leaving. The whole time we lived there, my sister and I never went down into the basement, as it was infested with spiders. I always thought it was because of the drinking and driving she left him, but as it turns out, that was only part of it. The other being that he had a massive grow-op for weed in the basement. Mom stated had the police found out about this, she would have lost custody of us. Murray has long since passed, but he would have had a giggle that weed is legal here now. Story 16. My grandpa's brother died when I was a child. I hardly knew the guy, so I wasn't too interested in the service. I vaguely remember my parents warning me not to stare at some of the men, but I figured that was a good manner moment. Fast forward to my late teens, early adult, and turns out, yep, we were surrounded by members of the Italian Mafia. Everyone in my family was tense, even the departed's wife, because they all knew he had some connection to them, but didn't exactly know, as he never spoke of it to anyone. Story 17. Not so much dark, as it was annoying and made me question everything, but I found out my biological dad actually was in my life for a few years. My family told me for most of my life that he left asterisk before asterisk. I was born because he was a deadbeat that couldn't take responsibility. In my 20s, I found a photo of him and me. My brother told me everything. The truth is that apparently there was an incident where Mom went a little crazy on him and he got arrested and left afterward. From then on, I took everything they said about him with a big grain of salt. Still never met him and don't really have a desire to. Just upset me that they lied for so long. Story 18, circa 1994. My dad died, 32, on Christmas Day. Instead of his family consoling my now single mother of two, they decided it would be more appropriate to use their spare key to enter our house and clean out all his belongings while we were picking out a tombstone. All his tools, clothes, pictures, he was a model. Then Grandpa on Dad's side takes my mom to court while she's mourning to try to prevent her from using his life insurance to raise us. Sister and I were 5 and 6 at the time. He wanted all the money to be set aside until we were 18. Judge pretty much threw his case out. Needless to say, my mom distanced herself from his side. I don't speak with them either. Found this out when I was like 20. Story 19. This might be a bit too weird for this thread. I am from a country still enshrined in a lot of superstition and religion. My great-great-grandmother was a crazy woman who practiced witchcraft. One day her husband died unnaturally. IRRC, he was murdered or something by the village, and Granny went mad. She gathered the village folk around and picked up a rock from the ground nearby and declared that the rock will be her curse and the village will suffer for killing her husband. After that, she killed herself. For multiple generations, my family worshipped the rock as a deity and prayed to lift the curse from the village. It ended when my father in his 20s got sick of his family doing stupid crap. Him and his cousins stole the rock overnight from someone's house and threw it near a railway track. And no, I wish I was making this up, but my father, uncles, and aunts all told me this story when I grew up. Story 20. Husband's family has a dark secret that still isn't out to the people who really need to know, and I hate that I know. His youngest aunt was sent away when she was a teenager, and shortly after she returned, the oldest uncle and his wife introduced the family to their daughter. Young aunt went on to have 3 more kids who have no clue that their cousin is actually their half-sister. What's even more effed up is that her brothers know the secret. I'm dreadful that someone will need a donor or do an ancestry test and all the lies will be exposed. Glad I could get that off my chest. If you're assuming this is a good Christian family, you would be correct. It's all about appearance. Story 21. My grandma and uncle were both diagnosed with cancer in the 90s. My uncle went into remission. Grandma died. Almost a decade later, my uncle's cancer came back in full force. He and his partner of 40 years were hoarders. My mom, his sister, didn't realize this initially because they lived about 2 hours apart. She only knew after her first visit to help take care of him. We all made several trips to help clean up. On one of these occasions, Uncle's common-law husband mentions he needs to hit up the P.O. box as they haven't collected mail in a few days. Mom offers to drive him. When they get back to the house, Mom notices a letter from the IRS addressed to Grandma. Weird because Grandma hasn't been alive to file taxes in almost 10 years. Turns out Uncle and Grandma had a joint bank account. He never notified authorities of her death. She still got direct deposits from Grandpa's government pension post-mortem because the government didn't know she was dead. Not only did my uncle illegally receive thousands of dollars of my grandma's pension, he also had several maxed out credit cards. He knew the cancer coming back was a death sentence and decided to live it up while he was still here. Story 22. My family has been involved in organized crime for multiple generations. My dad went clean and ended the cycle when me and my brother were born because he didn't want us to be criminals growing up. He kept a suitcase full of blackmail evidence, so no one on either side of the law could come after him. I only found out a couple years ago when I was helping him clean and came across the suitcase, and it was full of weird random garbage like Polaroids of random people and receipts from Home Depot. I was going to throw it away, and my dad freaked out that I had even opened it. I made him explain, and he said his dad forced him into the family business by guilting him that it's something our family's always done, so you're gonna have to learn. And he always resented his dad for it.